Dr. Esocbar and Dr. Cotter. I hope everyone is okay with this meeting being recorded. We are definitely trying to contribute content to our YouTube page and just to continue to share this information in many ways, and also getting into people who weren't able to actually join us today. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen and we can get to going. Give me 1 second. All right, can everybody see this okay? Cool, cool. Hold on, excuse me, y'all. I'm trying to, I actually got a, I'm fast. I got a new computer, a new setup, a new everything. My Zoom has recently been updated.
Is this a graduation present, Elise?
You know what? We could kind of sort of say that. I actually got it from my job. So they gave me like this whole new thing, and I haven't played with it as much as I probably should have to really get like acclimated. I'm so used to, you know, sticking with what you know in a sense. But it would be nice to call it a nice little graduation present. All right. And I actually have two screens, so it's like weird because they switch in and out, and one comes up forward and one comes up back. And so sometimes it doesn't quite show me. All right, so real quick, can somebody just confirm if they see the PowerPoint or if they see all the triangles? I mean, all the squares.
All the squares.
Squares. All right, so I need to do it again, and it shows that it's sharing on one. Let me stop it and do it again. I had this pre-prep last time, and I thought I did this time, but it's not. Ron, do you have it? Do you mind sharing the screen?
Yeah, I could do it right now.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Because it did another shift on my end. All right, perfect. So we'll just go ahead and get into the nitty gritty. So as you all are probably familiar with, if you haven't had all three of them already, I'm sure many of you will likely have all three, meaning Dr. Cotter, Dr. Schick, and Dr. Esocbar as instructors, whether you're in the undergraduate program or whether you're in the graduate program. And so just to kind of get things started, we'll go to the next slide if you don't mind. And so to the triangle of power, I would like you to introduce yourself. And then we also have a couple questions for you. So not just your name, but we also want to know your educational background so people can get to know you a little bit more. And then we try to come up with some fun questions for you all. So if you only had 30 minutes for a workout, 30 minutes only, what would you do to get it in? And then lastly, anything else you would like to share just in general. And it doesn't matter who goes first. If anyone feels led, they could definitely do so. If not, we'll be going to order that I see you guys.
I'll go first, since I think I end up having to talk first, right? Do I have to talk first? Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Evan Schick. I wasn't told that we had to bring an educational background to this, so I kind of don't know what to say to that, other than I went to UCSB for bachelor's. I did master's degree at Fullerton, and I did doctoral work at University of Toledo. And if I had 30 minutes for workout, what would I be doing? Nowadays it'd probably be walking my dog. I do that every day for 30 minutes. Anything else I'd like to share? Man, I'll be honest. I'm exhausted. I don't know if you guys have ever dealt with bed bugs, but man, I've been dealing with them and they suck. They really suck. And the treatment for them is very expensive. So I'm a little tired today. That's all I got.
Oh, thank you for that. And then just also to clarify regarding the educational background, that's actually perfect. So just in regards to like what your major was, what school you went to, maybe what you chose to do for your dissertation and your doctorate program, just a little insight to just give people just a little bit more knowledge about y'all.
But is this for me?
No, we go on to Dr. Escobar or
Oh.
Dr. Cotter.
Yeah, I'll go ahead because I think I'm next. Kurt Escobar, undergrad, exercise science from Fresno State, master's, Fresno State exercise science, and then PhD at the University of New Mexico. Did some sports nutrition stuff during my grad work, and then my dissertation was autophagy and interval training, which a lot of you have heard me talk about quite a bit at some point or another. If I had 30 minutes for a workout, I would do shrugs. I like shrugs. That's what I did today. So it's on my mind for 30 minutes straight. Anything else I would like to share? Well, if you're in 405, I shared quite a little bit in class today, which I won't recite here. I don't know. I'm from Fresno. That's a fact. A good one or a bad one, I'm not sure. People got strong feelings about Fresno. So
Ooh, thank you for that. The no, as it's often referred to by some people. All right, Dr. Cotter, would you like to share with us, please?
Hey, everyone. First off, Dr. Schick, I'm going to get a hold of you because I'm a huge DIYer now. And even though I haven't dealt with bed bugs, I just read how you can do your own treatment for bed bugs, shave off all your costs and all that. I do all my own work at home, so it saves a lot of money. So,
But does it kill the eggs? This is the only thing I care about is, does it kill the eggs?
yeah, it's what I have like a good site that uses what the pros use. So you just don't pay like the extravagant amounts for their labor. So
But do you have to bag everything up, or can you just leave everything in your place?
you'd have to move it to you'd have to move stuff around. Yeah.
Oh,
But,
Doc,
all right,
Doc,
maybe
you know
I'm
I
not the
can't do that.
biggest help. All right. All right. So where did I do my education? I started out with my undergrad at the Ohio State University, Go Bucks. I majored in management information systems, which is in the School of Business there. And then I changed my direction a bit and I stayed at the Ohio State University because it's so awesome, and did my master's in exercise science, but I focused on sports psychology and exercise behavior. And then I stayed at the Ohio State University again and did my PhD there, but focused on muscle physiology and biomechanics there. My dissertation was looking at the patellofemoral joint kinetics of the squat exercise at various loads and depths of the squat. I always loved squatting deep, and I heard a lot of people debating, oh, you shouldn't squat so deep, or you should only squat deep and all that jazz. And so that was my interest then, and still is. Today I've had some students do some follow-up studies on that. And then what brought me out to California was an NIH postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Irvine, where I started focusing on exercise countermeasures for spaceflight, how astronauts exercise up in space, which is still one of my major interests. And I also got to dabble in some radiobiology of the satellite cell, which is essentially the stem cell of muscle. And we were studying how radiation affects that, which is also important for spaceflight. And we looked at that from the cellular level, where we cultured satellite cells. And we also looked at it in the rodent model as well. I taught at Cal Poly for a couple years in Pomona, and I've been at Cal State Long Beach since 2014. If I only had 30 minutes for a workout, I'd definitely do some sort of strongman type training. I got a couple sandbags that I just bought a few weeks ago, a 100-pound and 150-pound sandbag, and it's a ton of fun doing that. A whole bunch of different exercises you can do with it. I have farmer's walk bars that I go in and out of the garage out into the street, making my neighbors, wonder what's wrong with that guy. So I like strongman stuff. I think that's would be a fun 30-minute workout. And then anything else I'd like to share? My son, Jaden, is going to be turning 3 years old here next month. and he's the biggest part of my life, best thing that's ever happened to me. So I think that's always what I would be willing to share if someone asked me.
That's exciting. I remember Dr. Cotter when I first started. It was the same year your son was born. And so one of the very first things before we knew each other on the scale that we know now, I was just a little young prospect. One of the things that you told me that you were very excited because your son was here or whatnot, and that you were spending a whole bunch of time over the summer, just, you know, getting to know him and things like that. So it's always interesting because as I progressed, I've also kind of like heard little stories here and there about his progression. So that's always like special and cool, knowing that like year 3 is here. So that's special. All righty, so as we get into the next slide, I'm just going to do a little plug real quick to just give a brief announcement because we don't have too many. It'll just be 2. So one of the very first things, since we all are here, I want to remind people, as we have been doing recently via our Instagram and other various forms of social media and email, is that we are looking for new executive board members. So there are a number of us graduating. I included Ron, who is a vice president. We have, I won't go through the whole list, but we have a number of people are graduating, which also means that we have a number of positions that will soon be vacant. So we definitely want to encourage you all to not only consider membership with this organization, but really search yourself to see if this is something that you might want to take on as well. And so I'll just open up the floor one more time in case Dr. Schick, Dr. Cotter, or Dr. Esocbar want to speak about maybe like any perks or pros about being a part of the organization on a leadership board scale. I know we talk about it as members, but maybe just hearing it from you guys, you know, any short thing might be something encouraging or something insightful that maybe we didn't say that might catch somebody else's ear.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start with that because I think leadership involvement with a student organization played a pivotal role in my development when I was in school. I started my own student organization when I was at The Ohio State University, and I held the president role, the treasurer role, vice president role, because I kept letting other people, you know, take those roles. And you better believe that showed up in my resume there. I mean, I had the title there, I had my responsibilities there, and quite frankly, I think it sets yourself apart from the students that are probably performing at a high level like you, but aren't doing additional activities like a super big involvement in a student organization like this one. It gives you things to talk about when you go to grad school, if you're being interviewed, or medical school or something like that. It gives you another talking point. And same if you're just trying to get a job. It's a really interesting topic. Exercise is medicine. You can talk about what its mission is, and then on top of that, that you played a critical role in its development at the university that you're at. So I just think it's a super big win for anyone that wants to get an edge with their future. So that's all I got.
Thank you for that. Dr. Esocbar, Dr. Schick, do you guys want to comment at all? Not mandatory, just opening up just in case.
I would just say that, just to echo Dr. Cotter's, one of Dr. Cotter's points is, it looks good on resumes and grad school applications. That, because we look at applications, and that is one thing that, you know, is a plus. So.
Yeah, I echo everything that those 2 guys said, and it offers you an opportunity to get alternate perspectives on things that you might not otherwise get.
Cool. Thank you all very much. So just to follow up on that, if anybody is interested, feel free to contact any of us board members. You can find all of our information, and not just on the slide, that's our main email address, but if you go to Beachsync and if you want to email us directly, it'll take you, if you click on our name or our picture, it'll take you straight to our inbox. And you could send us a message there as well, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. We also have shadowing opportunities as well, so don't be shy. Come on in and not only get to know us, but the org on another level as well, to see if it's something that you really want to take on. And the last announcement on a topic of exercise, we have a follow-along workout taking place this month. So in case anybody is interested, it is going to be on Zoom, so something a little different. There is a RSVP that is required. Jacqueline just dropped it down in the chat, so that is awesome. And it's taking place at 5 p.m. on the 19th. So if you're interested, definitely join us on that. But other than that, that's all the announcements that I have for us. Now let's get into the meat of it all. So first up, we have Dr. Schick, who will be sharing with us just an overview of strength training. So basically the way in which everything will go, we have strength training, which Dr. Schick will talk about. We have an overview of aerobic training, which Dr. Esocbar will talk about. And then Dr. Cotter will speak upon the differences and similarities of both training styles, as well as the benefits incorporating them both into your daily workout routines. So Dr. Schick, I will go ahead and give you the floor.
Thanks, Elise. I don't have a specific presentation to give, so I'm gonna do this a little bit differently. I see some names in here that I recognize, and I know you've been either in my class or you've taken the undergrad strength and conditioning class from somebody else. So first question I have is for the group. So what do you guys think strength is? If you could define strength, how would you define it? Silence is deadly.
I'd say that strength is the ability to exert force at a maximal level. It's a pretty easy definition. But I think it's deeper than that.
Deeper how? That sounded pretty good to me, man.
Deeper in that, like, you can express strength through not only maximal like efforts, but through, you know, different levels of intensity through exercise, whether it be like strictly you know, like weight training or aerobic training.
Okay, so you're bringing in sort of combining aerobic strength and anaerobic strength. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
But more so along the lines of anaerobic.
Okay, I would agree. If we're talking strictly about strength, and Elise, she put a gun to my head last week, guys. I just got to tell you, and she said, Dr. Schick, if you talk about anything but pure strength, I will pull this trigger. You have 24 hours. So if we're thinking about strictly strength, yeah, it's an anaerobic form of exercise, first of all. So what does that mean? What's anaerobic exercise mean?
Like not requiring oxygen.
Dr. Escobar, what do you think about that?
That is correct.
That is correct. We don't require oxygen. Where? Are we assuming that that's correct? So if I do like bench presses, if I do a set of bench presses, I don't need oxygen for that?
You don't need oxygen at the level of the muscle for that effort.
Okay. Does that mean oxygen is like there's zero oxygen in the muscle?
No.
Okay. So more specifically, when people say like anaerobic doesn't require oxygen, is there a more specific way to state that? If there's oxygen in the cell, and if you're still breathing oxygen is always present in the atmosphere when you're lifting weights. What does it mean when people sort of colloquially, meaning informally or a trendy way of saying it, where do we mean there's no oxygen, or where do we mean specifically that we don't need oxygen present in order to do it?
In the energy pathways?
Okay. Thomas, was that you?
Yeah,
Thomas, good to see you, man. I can't see you, but it's good to see your name and hear your voice.
I can see you as well.
Yeah, I think Jackson's doing pretty well in Arizona, I heard.
I think so too.
He's doing superhero training.
He is.
He is. So when we talk about anaerobic exercise, you're talking about the fact that you're using an energy pathway. You're primarily using an energy pathway where the ATP payoff occurs in the cytosol, not in the mitochondria. But to say that oxygen isn't required, I hear Dr. Escobar talk about this all the time. It is a misnomer to say that oxygen is not required or not present, or however, we hear these terms all the time from different sources, and we hear them kind of in different ways. But specifically for anaerobic exercise, pure strength training being an example, the ATP payoff that's required to fuel the muscle occurs in the cytosol, right? That doesn't mean that you're not producing ATP aerobically in the mitochondria, which requires the presence of oxygen, absolutely. But it just means that the majority of ATP required to fuel the sarcomere during a really intense contraction that occurs for just a few seconds. You think about how long a set of bench presses might take, or a set of squats might take, maybe I'm thinking like 8 to 10 reps, something like that. It's short. And so when you're doing an explosive activity that requires intense muscle contractions, right? It requires a lot of muscle fiber recruitment. It requires a recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers, a lot of type 2 muscle fibers, a type of exercise that requires a short duration. The ATP that's used to fuel that type of activity, that ATP is primarily produced in the cytosol, right? And what's the name of the pathway that produces it?
Glycolysis.
Glycolysis is one of them. Glycolysis plays a role. Specifically,
The phosphocreatine pathway.
the phosphocreatine pathway, or phosphagen system, whatever we want to call it, right? Where where there are sort of varying levels, but the sort of like flagship energy transducing chemical is known as phosphocreatine, right? The primary fuel for weightlifting, as we know it, is referred to as phosphocreatine. So it donates a phosphate to circulating adenosine diphosphate to form ATP, adenosine triphosphate, right? And that occurs in the cytosol. Now you can get in, there's a lot of sort of nuance in that too, because there's mitochondrial forms of that stuff too. But if I don't want to get shot by Elise, and I don't want that trigger to go off, I'm only going to talk about strength training right now. And so along those lines, keeping it as tight of a rope as possible, when we talk about anaerobic exercise, of which pure strength training would be, the type of exercise that is short duration, but very explosive, very intense, lots of hard contractions, but in a very short period of time. Anaerobics refers to the fact that the majority of ATP required to fuel that type of exercise, short duration, high intensity, it occurs in the cytosol. It occurs through the phosphocreatine system. It occurs through, you get a little bit of contribution from things like myokinase. You get a little bit of contribution from lactate forming glycolysis and stuff, depending on like how long your set might be, depending on how long you're resting, and all these things. But that's really what it means. So to go back to what Andres first said, he talked about he talked about imparting force maximally. I think that was the first thing he said, right?
Yes.
Okay. So can somebody give me an example of what that means? Because I don't know if everybody in here does strength training. I really have no idea. So can somebody not named Andres or Thomas? Thomas, you've already talked too much, buddy. You got a big mouth, but I love you for it. Can somebody else give an example of a type of exercise or a type of thing that you might see somebody doing in a gym where you're like, oh, that dude is really strong?
A 1RM squat.
A 1RM squat. Or somebody said a max deadlift. For our purposes, let's define max as a 1RM attempt. And so that nomenclature is important. For those of you who've been in my classes, you know I'm a stickler for the words that you're using. And so when we say the word max, let's define that as 1 repetition max, 1 repetition maximum. That's the wording that Dr. Escobar, Cotter, and I have to use when we publish stuff. So 1 repetition maximum, right? That's the nomenclature that we need to use when we're talking about expression of muscle strength, right? And so that's the amount of load that you can lift for 1 full attempt of whatever lift that is. And so for Sylvia, you said squat. So like 1 full downward phase and upward phase of the back squat. That would be a 1 RM. If you loaded, which means, and Sylvia does this all the time because she's a competitive powerlifter, if you load an amount of weight onto a bar that enables you to do 1 full repetition, meaning the downward and then the upward phase of, let's say, the squat, but you cannot do any more than that, that is a 1 repetition maximum attempt. That would be somebody's 1 RM. So if Sylvia goes under the bar and she loads, Sylvia, what are we doing these days on back squat for your 1 RM?
I PR'd at 303.
303 pounds. Well, that would sever my spine in 7 places if I tried that. She does 303 pounds for her 1 RM, which means that she can load 303 pounds onto a bar, load it under her back. She can do a downward phase, an eccentric phase, followed by concentric upward phase, and then she has to rack the bar. If she does that successfully for that 1 full repetition, that would be her 1 RM. And you would say that person's very strong because she could lift 303 pounds. So when we talk about like the textbook definition of what strength is, nomenclature is important. The words you use are important. And as it relates to the expression of strength, we talk about it in terms of 1 RM. How much can you lift in 1 rep? That would be a great way to define strength. Now you can define it metabolically too, which is what we were sort of initially getting into, or initially turning into, where we were talking about the major energy pathways that are responsible for fueling that 1 RM. And so you can define it metabolically as type of exercise that primarily relies on phosphocreatine system or the phosphagen system to produce the ATP needed to fuel the sarcomere, to fuel the muscle. So you can define strength, you can find all these terms a few different ways, practically speaking, metabolically speaking. With strength training, you're training all sorts of aspects, right? You're training metabolism, you're training biomechanics, you're training muscle mechanics. You're training all sorts of things. Your body's adapting in many different ways, but it's also adapting specifically to the imposed demands that you're putting on it. Hey, Elise, how do you want me to handle questions when they pop up? I didn't realize that they were a question. I just saw there's questions here. Or,
Yeah, you can answer it.
Okay. So Ron says, if you could put a % on how much creatine subs actually aid in lifting, what would it be? Ron, I want you to look at me. You should take creatine if you're not. It's for my money, and I am frugal as all hell. If I'm to buy one supplement to aid in my strength gains as I start a new strength training program, and this is assuming that I'm already eating enough protein in my diet, I'm going to choose creatine and nothing else. Creatine is definitely the most effective. It's also the most well-researched strength supplement on the market. And it's also super cheap. It's super cheap. And I don't know how much I'm supposed to talk about this, Elise. You can tell me how much you want me to talk about it, but yeah, percentage-wise, Ron, it a big percentage. It can help a pretty big percentage. Research is kind of settled on creatine. It's been settled on creatine for a number of years in terms of its aid for strength. I think the more interesting research nowadays on creatine has to do with its antioxidant capabilities and its ability to improve cognition and maybe curb degradation of convulsant disorders in the nervous system. But that's sort of a different conversation. So
I have a percentage on impact on creatine supplementation.
go for it.
Because in sports nutrition, I have a 3-hour lecture on creatine. So the literature states between a 10 to 20% performance increase in high intensity repetitive exercise, which is like, that's what strength training is. So if you map that onto training and adaptation, more training stimulus, greater training load, greater adaptation. And then in terms of straight up comparing creatine supplementation to a placebo, so maximum strength in a 1 RM, 3 RM, 10 RM, comparison of creatine supplementation to placebo, a 8% difference compared to placebo, and then maximum repetitions at a given maximum repetitions is about a 14% increase compared to placebo. So it's not a trivial one. So yeah, it's a
pretty big difference.
Yeah.
Numbers are one, percentages are one thing, but to do it in real life, it's a big difference. It's a big difference. Elise, I don't know how much you want me to talk about like these questions, because as Dr. Escobar said, I mean, we all three of us could talk about creatine for the rest of the time, but so Ron, good question. Let me try to bring myself back on to the track that was going on. Guys, I don't have like the greatest memory, and I didn't prepare slides. So if I get too far off, like on a tangent, I'm not going to remember who I am, where I am, or what year it is. So let me try to like dial it back here. I think I was going to talk about the fact that you can define strength in like a couple of different ways, practically speaking, in terms of the 1 RM, metabolically speaking, in terms of the energy pathway that's primarily responsible for fueling an expression of strength. You could define it a few different ways. I do want to touch on the applied part of this, though, because I think that's part of it too, right? At least, do you want me to talk about parameters of strength training, like as in programming?
Yeah, so what we could probably do, let me look at the time, 5:37. So what we could probably do, since that was a good introduction of it, I'm thinking if we could do maybe like a full circle to touch up on the other two real quick, and then we can maybe get more specific into the programming aspect, because then that kind of brings it into something that we could do on an applied level.
Please take the microphone out of my hand. Thank you.
All right, cool. All
Did you
right,
shoot me? Did you shoot me yet?
No, it's still good.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Escobar, you can go ahead and take over.
all right. For those of you that are in 405 and 552, maybe no one's in 552 right now. Some of this stuff is like, you're going to hear me repeat some of the stuff because that's what we're covering 405 right now. So the way I sort of talk about it is not strictly say aerobic, but I categorize like metabolic training, metabolic conditioning, because aerobic, is, suggests that it's, exclusively related to aerobic metabolism, endurance exercise, things like that. But, like we talk about in class, different types of exercise, higher intensity exercise, more anaerobic component type exercise also has big impacts on health and function and fitness, and shares a lot of the same adaptations that aerobic endurance-based training does, even though it might not be like a primarily aerobic type of training. So for example, today we talked about interval training and we talked about CrossFit, and we looked at the metabolic profiles of those types, or specifically CrossFit, because I referenced my thesis and then I showed a video, and then that got me onto a story that I'm not going to share in this context. But if you were there, and even though, something like CrossFit is high intensity, high power, high force, high speed, things like that, there is a big aerobic component to it. And the reason for that is because of the duration. And so in 405, we talk about how, yes, duration of exercise dictates what the metabolic profile, like what energy system is going to be used for that performance or the activity. But the more important thing is going to be the intensity, because the intensity is going to determine the duration, like we've talked about, right? If it's high intensity, it cannot last very long. Why? Because you're going to tax those energy systems that are higher power, but shorter, more fatigable, right? And in terms of, the applied side, and we'll talk more about this in the end of 405, and prescription and programming. I mean, I talk about my experience training and clients and all that sort of thing all the time. From a practical standpoint, you want to be creative in terms of like the aerobic stuff that you are going to use with your clients if you're working with clients, because someone is not going to be interested in coming to you and then you putting them on a treadmill for half an hour for an hour. Like they're not going to want to pay you month after month for that, because they could do it on their own. And so what you want to do is, especially if they're interested in, losing weight, because we talked about aerobic exercise is the biggest bang for the buck in terms of burning calories and incurring a calorie deficit, or someone who just wants to increase their general endurance or fitness or stamina to be able to like go up a flight of stairs and not get tired, or play with their kids and not get overly fatigued and things like that. If you want to focus on developing aerobic fitness, you can do that in different types of ways. And I always reference circuit training, right? And so like CrossFit is just like circuit training on steroids, right? But you're doing different types of resistance-based training, strength training, body weight, or barbells or dumbbells or TRX, something like that. But you're structuring it in a way that you have an aerobic component. So you're kind of, and Dr. Cotter will probably mention this in his piece, but you're getting the benefit of both aspects of training. And so for 95% of my clients, even the clients that I work with now, is the older population and limited population, like I'm doing a circuit style based type of training. Now, depending on their specific goals, I might focus more on the aerobic aspect, or I might focus more on the resistance training aspect. If they want to increase their endurance, increase their conditioning and their stamina, and they're focused on losing weight or losing fat, then you focus more, you can structure your circuit training style workout with a greater aerobic component, so you get more of an aerobic adaptation rather than a strength-based adaptation. If someone is more focused on increasing lean body mass, changing body composition by increasing lean body mass, or developing strength or muscular endurance, then you can use more, or you can focus more on the resistance and strength-based aspect. But you're getting the benefits of both. And for most people, if like we talk about in class, right? There's a difference between someone that engages in athletics, or there's an athlete, or someone that has a very, very specific training adaptation or training goal, like the fitness bros, or like me, I just lift weights, right? Because I have a specific goal. But for most people, they just want to feel better, be healthier, lose some weight, increase their general conditioning. And so a combination of both is going to be the best thing to do for them. And you can play around with like what you focus on, and you can play around with it like within a session, or within a period of training, or with it like over a month or a couple of weeks, and you can play around with that. In terms of, I know I'm talking fast, but in terms of, say the health benefit, aerobic exercise is pretty much the biggest bang for the buck. And we talk about it in class. Why? Because it's a systemic, it's a whole body response. So you get a whole body adaptation, right? Where resistance training is a little bit more localized. But aerobic exercise, metabolic training stresses the entire system, right? It's a whole body sort of thing. And so you have more of a global response. You have a bigger change or adaptation. And that's why aerobic exercise, or developing aerobic capacity, VO2 max, is associated with better health outcomes and reduced risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease risk and things like that. Now, resistance training, it does the same thing, right? Same impact, positive health outcomes. Having more muscle mass is associated with like decreased development of insulin resistance and diabetes and things like that. But like we talk about in class, VO2 max, which is a thing that is like we do all the time. Well, not right now because our lab is shut, but VO2 max, which is something that we do all the time, right? It's like, oh yeah, VO2 max, we're doing that in lab today. Like it's not a big deal, right? But something as simple as that, and we do on the daily, generally speaking, is, like I mentioned in class, is the best biomarker for overall health and premature mortality. Why? Because it gives an overall assessment of the body's ability to accommodate stress, right? It's a whole body response. And so it assesses that. So that's why, having some sort of aerobic focus is beneficial. And So one of the question is like do's and don'ts. I guess one do is like, just do it. Right. Or if you're working with a client, just figure out something that they will do, or that they don't mind doing, or that they'll do consistently. Right. Because if you're working with clients and you make them do something that they don't want to do, they're going to stop paying you and they're going to stop coming to see you. So when you work with someone, you know, and you can, you know, think about this in your own sort of like training lives, is you got to balance what the adaptation, what the goal is, with what they are interested in, what they enjoy, and what they will do. And you have to marry those things. And sometimes it's more difficult than others, but you sort of have to balance those two things: what they should do, what they need to do, with what they will do. And then I guess maybe just to like cover my own self, because I'm talking about the benefits of aerobic exercise, and I do zero aerobic exercise. You know, I might be dipping my toes in Dr. Schick's section. But there's more research that has come out to show that engaging in resistance training does increase mitochondrial content and does improve mitochondrial function. Now, is it the same degree as aerobic exercise? Probably not. No, I don't think there's any direct comparisons with that. But there is some mitochondrial biogenesis effect in resistance training. And like we've talked about in class, generally speaking, like a good axiom to have in mind is the more mitochondria, the better health you're in, the better function you're going to have, better metabolic function you're going to have, right? Which we talked about with diabetes today. So I don't know, I think that might be good for now. No? Okay. I think Elise froze.
I think she did. So I'll go ahead and take my turn, since it must be my turn. I am the nerd that created a PowerPoint presentation. So let's see if it'll let me share. You guys see it?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Hold on just one second. I want to get my little pointer up. And I want to turn on the chat too, just in case. There we go. All right, so really nice discussion so far from Drs. Escobar and Schick. And what Dr. Escobar said really leads well into what I'm going to cover here on sort of combining aerobic exercise and strength training or resistance exercise. And just like the way this talk was set up, we oftentimes think of exercise as a dichotomous variable. You know, we have aerobic or we have strength training, just like we see on the screen. But in reality, we have more of an exercise intensity continuum, right? If you think about it, you can take, for instance, a strength exercise like the squat, since I love the squat. And you could be doing like Sylvia. I think I heard, I kind of broke out there for me, but I think she's doing something like 300 pounds, right? Clearly that's a strength training activity. But if we strip that down little by little and have her perform as many reps as possible, hell, she might be doing 100 some reps with no weight, you know? So what is the squat now? Is the squat still a strength training exercise? Is it aerobic? So I think that gives a little bit of an example of how really, you know, discussing exercise just in general is really, really difficult, even from a research perspective, because it is more of a continuum. And there are countless ways of performing exercise all along the spectrum. So to control for that and try to determine what the physiological adaptations are to exercise is really, really difficult. So there's still a lot more to be done out there. You know, in research-wise, that all you guys can hopefully be doing if you get involved in research. So I want to start off I'm going to be talking about concurrent training, which is what a lot of people do. That is, they're performing some sort of aerobic type training as well as a mode of strength training as well, to various degrees. Like Dr. Escobar said, maybe someone really likes strength, so they have a large focus on strength, but they're performing aerobic exercise once or twice a week. Or you might have someone that's like a competitive runner or a triathlete that's supplementing with strength training once or twice a week, right? So there's different versions of concurrent training as well, further making it difficult for us to discuss. But no discussion of concurrent training would be complete without talking about some data that came out in 1980, the year I was born, from Hickson, that started to introduce this idea of an interference effect that occurs when someone partakes in aerobic exercise training and strength training, to where you can't maximize the benefits of both if you do concurrent training. Basically stating that if you want max benefits, you got to do either aerobic exercise alone or you got to do strength training alone. That's not completely true. I'll show you the data here in a second. But basically with the data here from this study, you can see over the duration of 10 weeks, you have this, the curve at the bottom is the group that did strength and endurance training. And you can see the top line is the group that just did strength training alone. And this figure is looking at strength increases. To be perfectly honest, I forget what measure of strength they did. I think it was the squat, maybe a leg press. And you can see that from the start to the finish, even though they started higher, they still had a greater increase over the duration of the 10 weeks than those that were doing strength training with endurance training. If you look on the right side, however, this is looking at the amount of work done in a cycling exercise. There really wasn't much difference. So basically they were saying that if you are partaking in concurrent training, that your endurance training might inhibit your strength increases. However, your strength training might not really be inhibiting your endurance increases. And I think some of the more current research still mimics some of that. And I'm going to present some of that more current research here today. So we're bumping up to 2017 here. This had some really nice figures that I wanted to share with you. So if we look at this figure here, this is looking at sort of the course of someone's training history, where you start training, you're in an untrained state. And we all know that basically you can do just about anything and you're going to experience some physiological adaptations to it. And we see some overlapping of the lines here with an untrained individual. And this is occurring over days and weeks. When we go and get someone to moderately trained in duration of months, we see that there's mostly overlap here too, but there's starting to be a separation here. And this is a separation that occurs when we're looking at a comparison between someone that's doing a single mode training, like just endurance exercise, or the dashed line where someone is concurrently training. And you can see as we move into a highly trained individual and years of training where it takes much more intensity, much more effort to see physiological adaptation, you start seeing this separation where if you still partake in concurrent exercise training, it's much harder for you to see those individual adaptations that you might be looking for. So this is very important for very trained athletes or elite level athletes. And basically they came and said with training history, there's an impaired response to concurrent training. And they basically said that generically. So it could be strength or an endurance impairment. This is from the same research article here too. And you can see, if you look at an untrained individual, if you have endurance training only, this is actually quite interesting. If we're moving to the left of this figure, that's aerobic endurance adaptations. If we go to the right, that's hypertrophy strength type adaptation. You take an untrained individual and you have them start doing endurance training, yes, a vast majority of their increases will be seen from the endurance side of things. But at the same time, without doing any type of strength training whatsoever, they actually will increase to obviously a smaller extent, but they will increase some strength and hypertrophy in response to doing that endurance training. Pretty cool, right? And the alternative happens with resistance training. They're going to gain a lot more strength, a lot more hypertrophy, but they're also going to see some endurance benefit as well, just by partaking in resistance training only. And you take that new person, untrained individual, and you have them do concurrent training, and you see actually the max benefit on both sides of this spectrum when they do concurrent training. Definitely a no-brainer to get someone involved in both types of training when they're untrained. If you look at the trained, however, this is where they show that there's an impairment, right? And basically, let's just look at the CT, which is concurrent training. There's actually not really much of an impairment on the endurance side of things. And this mimics the Hickson article that I mentioned way back in 1980. So, almost 30 years later, stating the same thing. But there is a slight impairment on the resistance training side of things. So I did want to update you that still the knowledge of what we have today still seems to mimic basically what Hickson was saying in the 1980s. But that's not the whole story, so I'm going to present just a little bit more here as well. This is one of those, boy, that's a lot of stuff on the screen. Don't worry. I'm going to be presenting several of these. These are called forest plots, and they're really cool research articles that go out and they look at a whole bunch of past research and they try to take all the data, combine it together, and find some conclusions to it. Basically, what this one is looking at is concurrent exercise having a negative effect on lower body strength in trained, but not moderately trained or untrained individuals, mimicking exactly what we just saw on the previous slide from a different research study. And that impairment is present only when training is performed within the same training session, but not so much if you're performing your different modes of training with some time between them, at least 2 hours, right? And basically, if you look here, look at the red sort of sideways diamond, right? If you move to the left side of this line, it means it favors resistance training. If you move onto the right side of this line, you favor concurrent training. Basically, this diamond's right in the center. It means it doesn't really matter for an untrained individual on outcomes with strength, again, mimicking what I already presented. In moderate trained, you can see that effects on strength are favoring resistance training, and that diamond moves even further left in very trained individuals, meaning that, yes, again, most people are going to see greater increases in strength if following just a strength training program versus a concurrent training program. Now, there's a really cool study that came out this year, 2022. Dr. Lundberg's a colleague of mine in Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. So he just came out with this, and really cool research. Same way we're looking at these figures with the look at the diamonds at the bottom of these sections. So I highlighted the first section. This is effect on leg press strength. Again, if we move to the left, we're favoring strength training. If we move to the right of that dotted line in the middle, we're favoring concurrent training. With the leg press, actually a little bit more on the concurrent training side, but not by much. If we look at the squat exercise, with squat strength, we're favoring strength training only a bit. And at the bottom, there's isometric torque and dynamic knee extension too. In general, if we look at the very, very bottom, which takes everything into consideration, there's only a slight favor to strength training over concurrent training with effects on all these different measurements of strength. So again, doesn't look like there's much impairment at all, at least from this particular perspective. If we look at explosiveness, like jump height here at the top, you can see there's a slight favor to strength training only. There's other measurements of explosive strength too, where there's a little bit more of a favor towards strength training. But again, only a very slight favorment towards strength training. And then the last one I want to show here as well is the topic I like the most, which is what's the effect on hypertrophy? You want to gain muscle mass. Should you not do aerobic training? I think some people actually state that. Looking at this particular data, you can see that the diamond is a little bit to the right. It's favoring concurrent training in response to the cross-sectional area of the quadriceps, which is the shaded, yellow shaded area. That was from MRI scans, CT scans, so on and so forth, ultrasound imaging. If we look at DEXA, which can compartmentalize increases in lean body mass to the lower body, which is what they did here, you can see there was actually no difference really between resistance training versus concurrent training. And overall data shows that there's really no difference between strength and concurrent training either, which I thought was very, very cool. Now I have two last slides I'm going to do, because this is exercise as medicine. I want to relate this a little bit back to health as well. This is looking at hemoglobin A1C, which is an important marker for those interested in diabetes management. And same kind of plot here. So we look at this diamond at the bottom. This one just looked at aerobic versus resistance exercise. And Dr. Schick can chime in a lot on this particular topic if people have questions. But there's only a slight favor towards aerobic exercise than resistance exercise. And the key from some of these is when I say that, it slightly favors, the whole point is, at least from my perspective, is there isn't much difference between picking one or the other on this effect, right? And I pulled a bit of a quote here. There is no evidence of clinical importance of aerobic versus resistance training on diabetic control. The direct quote, there is also no evidence that resistance exercise differs from aerobic exercise on cardiovascular risk markers or safety. No difference between the two. And last slide. On chronic heart failure, let me just read the quote because it sums it up better than I could. Combined aerobic and resistance training is superior to aerobic exercise training to reverse or attenuate the loss of muscle mass and improve exercise capacity, muscle strength, and quality of life in individuals with chronic heart failure. Regular exercise, irrespective of what kind of exercise you're doing, is beneficial for patients with chronic heart failure to prevent or reduce the decline in exercise capacity. It's exacerbated by a sedentary lifestyle in these patients. And you look at the figure that they got here, right? Aerobic training is really good at improving cardiac function. You see all these nice up and down arrows. Resistance training, not so much. You go a little bit lower. The authors talk about resistance training, however, being superior with arterial remodeling, in addition to all the great stuff it does with skeletal muscle function. So that's how they came to that conclusion, that doing both is much better than doing just one of those modes of exercise. This brings me to my final slide. Get out there and have fun. Do something that is in the middle of the spectrum. Strongmen do these types of exercises where, most of us can't even lift that up. This is Martins Lises. He's just won the Arnold Strongman competition. He's going to be doing World's Strongest Man in a couple weeks, but he's up in LA around the Venice area, I believe. So you should root for him. He's a really cool guy. But, do something like Dr. Escobar was saying. You got to get people in there doing something that they enjoy, that's fun to do, something that they're going to maintain. And ideally, if you can get them to do it, something that incorporates a large portion of that spectrum of exercise that I presented early on in the presentation. Okay, that's it. Elise, you're back.
Yeah, no, I was froze for a minute. Cool, thank you for that. So one thing I will announce, I know we are right at 6 o'clock, we're now 6:01. So first, just to check in with Dr. Escobar, Dr. Cotter, and Dr. Schick. Are you guys okay for just a few more moments? Yeah, all right, cool. So to all those who are able to stay and continue with us for just a little while longer, you are more than welcome. Or if you have to leave now, that is completely understandable. We will put this video up on YouTube, so anything that you missed, you'll be able to follow up and catch the rest of it. So basically what we want to do now is just kind of open up the floor to questions. So we were able to receive right now a lot of great content to just break down each aspect of exercise and then the benefits of how they affect us when it comes to our body and our overall health. And so if anybody has questions, you can take it away. If not, we do have some as well that we can also ask, and maybe we could even get into maybe going back to that programming question that Dr. Schick was going to talk about if not. So let's go ahead and either use the hand function if you're comfortable with that, or you could just unmute yourself if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, I have a question. So earlier we talked a little bit about creatine, and I've heard that it can be a little bit dehydrating. Like you have to drink a lot of water when you're on creatine. Are there any other negative consequences if you take that supplement?
Schick, do you want to take that since that's your section? Or
I was gonna ask you if you wanted to. I'm definitely not doing something on my other screen here, just so you know. Henley, welcome to the exercise internship class for the fall, first of all.
Hey, thanks. Yeah.
Secondly, there are a couple case studies where folks have had odd kidney ailments in response to creatine. Frankly, if you want to find a problem with anything, you can find it because Google's really, really massive. And there's lots of case studies. There's lots of research on every last thing within health. And so if you're looking for a problem with creatine, you can probably find it. I would say this is that read research very carefully and you got to know what you're looking at. So I'm aware of a couple case reports where folks have had odd kidney problems rise from creatine use. The ones that I'm aware of do a very poor job of highlighting the fact that those patients already had kidney disease. So if you're somebody who has a kidney ailment or an inherited kidney ailment, or you have kidney disease, frankly, there's a lot of things you shouldn't be doing. Creatine's one of them. But outside of that stuff, Henley, if you're a healthy person, and I'm going to underscore that word healthy, if you've been cleared by a doctor to exercise and you've had routine lab work, checkups done, and everything looks fine, then creatine's not gonna hurt you. It'll help you. To your question about it being dehydrating, yeah, look at creatine as a molecule. It's hydrophilic. That means it's water loving. And so that means that whatever compartment it enters in your body, it's going to pull water from. And so some folks, more than others, but some folks do experience dehydration because creatine, as it's moving through your body, it starts binding up the polar ends of water. And so, yes, you can get water being pulled into your gut at a heightened level. And so some folks do get either constipated with that or they get diarrhea, one of those two. What will happen to you, I have no idea. The majority of the time, folks are fine. I think an important thing to do is drink water. I always say that don't make the day you start creatine also the same day that you stop drinking fluid. You should definitely drink fluid if you're taking creatine because it is hydrophilic. It can be slightly dehydrating for certain compartments of your body, particularly your gut. But another important thing is to not take too much. Nobody needs to do the so-called saturation program where you're taking like 5 times the recommended allotment for like a week in hopes of saturating your muscle fiber with creatine. Nobody needs to do that. You get the same effects starting right off the bat, taking 5 grams or less. It just takes maybe a little bit longer to have the creatine effect if you do it that way. But unless you're in a race to have a creatine effect, then you don't need to do a loading scheme. It'll be just as effective. So be careful with the amount that you're taking. And a big thing, this might sound stupid or obvious, but know what a teaspoon is. Know what a teaspoon is, because the serving size 5 gram of a creatine monohydrate is going to be a teaspoon. 5 grams is a teaspoon. Nobody would need to take more than that. And so if you don't know what a teaspoon is, get a teaspoon measure, and then you'll see how small that is. I think folks maybe run into trouble sometimes when they don't know what that means, what 5 grams means. And so they take way too much. And then they don't drink enough or they overexert themselves. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I got it. Can you repeat what you said about the serving size? Is it 5 grams per week? Is that what you said? Or per day?
5 grams per day. 5 grams per day, and that comes out to a teaspoon.
Okay, gotcha.
Basically a teaspoon or less. There's actually a formula that you can use to calculate exactly how much creatine you might personally need. And I don't know what the formula is off the top of my head. I don't know if either of these guys has it available, but for most folks, it's under 5 grams. Like if I were to take creatine, again, I don't currently take it, but if I was, I think for me, I once calculated that it's like 3.5 grams a day, something like that. So you got to buy a nice kitchen scale to measure that stuff out. But yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you.
On the same topic of creatine, Dr. Schick, if you don't mind, I remember we talked about this in your class. You mentioned that there's different types of creatine. So it seems like this is a hot topic. So would you state your recommendation? I know from what I remember, I believe you said creatine monohydrate is best. But for those who are interested in getting into creatine a little bit more, can you talk about just slightly the difference between each one? And
yeah, I'm gonna be totally honest. I am not up on all the different forms of creatine nowadays. I know that they package it in capsules now, or they add certain esters onto it to hopefully reduce like GI upset and stuff like that, or to hopefully increase absorption. And the only form that I'm familiar with in terms of like effectiveness and high absorption is creatine monohydrate. Creatine monohydrate is absorbed something like 85 to 90%. So like 85 to 90% of the creatine monohydrate you put into your mouth makes it into your bloodstream. And that's a high rate of absorption, which is good. But creatine monohydrate is a powder. It's a powder. It is very poorly solubilized in your body. It has very low solubility in water or just in fluid in general. So if you're going to buy creatine monohydrate, a couple tips is to mix it into something warm, not super hot, because creatine monohydrate's unstable at like real high temperatures. So you don't want to like boil it, but in something warm or in something acidic. Sometimes folks put it into like coffee, which I think is probably fine. Sometimes people put into like orange juice, which might be fine. It can be difficult to completely solubilize it in the liquid that you're drinking, but that's not super important. You know, even if it's not completely solubilized in the liquid that you're dissolving it in, you can still drink it. Just drink it. You might have like a little bit of like grittiness that gets into your throat, but that's fine. Just chase it with some pure water after that. So creatine monohydrate, it's cheap too.
Yeah, one thing I was going to put on top of that, despite its effectiveness, which is super highly studied, by the way, I think it might have been mentioned, but it is one of the most well-studied supplements out there, maybe right behind caffeine. But even if there was another form out there that was a little bit better, it probably doesn't even matter, and you're going to be paying way more for it. And that's something to consider with all kinds of supplements too, because I used to be, really interested in all the, latest supplements and all of that. But, now that I have a greater idea of, what really is going to make a difference and how much of a difference you can make physiologically, what supplements do in general is not much. The vast majority of the supplements out there are very effective ones, creatine being one of them. But the fancy pantsy creatine that's coming out that's going to charge you like 10 times the amount of creatine monohydrate, even if it was a little bit better, is it really worth the 10 times the amount of creatine monohydrate? If you have boundless finances, maybe, but I would say for most people, not. Something to consider.
I'll just follow up on that one point. So like Dr. Schick said, creatine monohydrate is uptaken to a very, very high degree. So in terms of like differences in like what you actually really care about is creatine saturation in the muscle. So there might be differences, like this graph shows us there's a little bit differences in terms of creatine entering the bloodstream upon ingestion. But in terms of, so this is one figure, in terms of muscle saturation with different types of creatine, obviously there's going to be, numerous types of creatine types that are out there, and not every single one is going to be studied. But in general, like Dr. Cotter was mentioning, it's not going to be that big of a difference. And like most of the creatine literature and the position stands and things like that, will go on to state that the differences in bioavailability or like the kinetics of how it hits the bloodstream and the rate, probably not going to matter, because again, like Dr. Schick mentioned, the bioavailability of creatine, like it getting uptaken into the muscle, is very, very high. So the type is not going to make a difference. It's going to get it, monohydrate is going to get into the muscle, and that's the only thing that you are interested in. Now, to follow back up to the initial question, or one of the initial questions in terms of safety, I have this slide from my creatine lecture, and there's really no documented adverse health risk. Of course, there might be some anecdotal stuff, and maybe someone might have a negative reaction, but by and large, in terms of what it does, what it potentially people might think it caused, but it doesn't increase the incidence of musculoskeletal injuries, dehydration, muscle cramping, gastrointestinal upset, or renal dysfunction. Now, obviously there might be some individual differences and people might respond a little bit different, but by and large, it's very, very well tolerated. And it is safe, particularly with the issue with renal function. So this comes from the ISSN position stand, stating that individuals with pre-existing renal diseases consult with their physician. But if you don't have a pre-existing renal condition, your kidneys are going to be fine. And then, there was one more thing I was going to say. It just escaped me. Shoot. One other question that you might have is, if I consume creatine, if I supplement with creatine, then do I need to cycle off? Because is that going to affect the endogenous, because our body makes creatine and we get it from red meat and other stuff, but our body does make it. Creatine supplementation does not affect the endogenous production. So there's no real rationale that I can see as to why you would need to cycle off. You're just going to go through a period of less than fully saturated muscle stores of creatine. I mean, you could do that, but it's not like you need to cycle off of it because it's going to shut down your creatine production. So
that's a really important point that Dr. Escobar brings up. And it brings up a related question that I think everybody on here should know if you don't know. And that is, what the hell is creatine? What is it as a chemical, as a molecule? To Dr. Escobar's point, no, it doesn't shut down endogenous production of creatine. And that's because creatine is not a hormone. It is not a hormone. I'm going to repeat that. It is not a hormone. We do see the effect that Dr. Escobar speaks of when we talk about exogenous injection of hormones like testosterone or testosterone analogs, or estrogen or estrogen analogs. But creatine is not a hormone. So it works by a different set of metabolic laws. So then the question is, what is creatine then? If it's not a hormone, what is it? Is it made of lipid? Like, is it a fat? It is not a fat. Is it made of protein? It is not made of protein, but it is made of amino acids that have kind of been like pimped out. It's kind of like that old show with Exhibit on MTV called Pimp My Ride. And I'm sure nobody knows what the hell that show is, but I'm old enough to know. And that's all that matters. Basically, creatine it's a peptide. It's 3 amino acids that have had some chemistry rejiggering done to them. And that's what it is. It's a peptide. It's basically a combination of 3 amino acids that are bound together. They've had addition of some methionine, histidine attached, and homocysteine attached. And that's about it. And creatine is made endogenously by your body. So you're basically putting something into your body that your body already makes. Kidneys and liver make it. They work together to make it. Kidney initiates the formation of creatine. Liver finishes the final product of creatine before it exports it out to the rest of your body. So that's what creatine is. It's basically a peptide.
Well, thank y'all for that. I feel like we got like a 3-way answer on that one. So it'll open up some like good conversation. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I have a question on concurrent training. So if I were to do lower body resistance training and I followed it up with upper body aerobic training, would that interference effect occur in my lower body strength?
Is that directed towards me?
I don't know. Yeah, you said.
I mean, if you look at the evidence on the potential interference effect, that's probably one of the worst situations. Probably be even worse to do aerobics in front of resistance exercise. I should have put it in there, but when I teach advanced ex-phys, I have a figure on the molecular response to resistance exercise and to aerobic exercise, and showing how there's potential interference with the molecular response to those 2 different modes of exercise. And so whether it's before or after, I think if there is an interference effect and you think it might be detrimental to your particular situation, which I think in most cases is probably not the case for the vast majority of people. Because I think most people are going to fall into the untrained or moderately trained group that was discussed earlier in my presentation. And even if you were in the trained, it really depends on how important that particular variable is, with all the goals that you have. If you were wanting to maximize lower body strength, but you still wanted to do that aerobic exercise, I would at least push it out a couple hours, if not, in the other half of the day, like a morning, evening, or even the next day. But again, I don't think for most people, it's something to even worry about.
All right, thank you. Also, question on creatine. At what point do you think we should increase dosage of creatine? Like, as I obtain or more muscle mass during my training program, should I increase the dosage from 5 to 10? And when do you think I should increase the dosage?
I don't know if you guys have newer research, but to my knowledge and my understanding, you don't need to.
That's what I was going to say.
Thank you.
So this might be
I
a
will-
little beyond my scope, but Dr. Schick, you said that creatine has some antioxidant properties. All I know is that creatine just aids in the PCR system. So could you elaborate on how creatine has antioxidant properties?
Yeah, so an antioxidant is any type of chemical that can buffer loose electrons. And so creatine is one of those things that can do that. It in fact, creatine itself can bind up hydrogen protons and electrons. And so, and it does that in muscle, but that means it can do it in other tissues as well. And most notably, it can do it in neuronal tissue. So in brain neurons, it's been observed to act as an antioxidant, binding up loose electrons in brain cells. So that's an important thing, potentially for things like aging, potentially for things like neurodegenerative disorders, dementia, Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, all these types of things. There's some pretty good research. Off the top of my head, I don't know the authors' names, but there's some pretty good research on creatine and antioxidation and cognition. If you Google those, or into Google Scholar, if you look up those keywords, there's all, and it's all fairly new. All this stuff is fairly new.
Yeah, some of that I'm not too familiar with either, but another word you might want to throw in there to look at is nootropic, which is like cognitive function enhancer. It could be a drug or it could be a supplement, and creatine is proposed to be, in that class. So nootropic, nootropic, pretty interesting area to look into.
All right, any other questions from the floor?
We could talk creatine all day if you couldn't tell.
Honestly, was thinking it. I was like, oh man, I was like, creatine.
This is
going.
actually making me want to take it. I haven't taken it in years.
So what is so interesting about like creatine? Because you guys said it's the most researched thing on the, I don't know, strength or just training in general. So is there a lot more that we don't know about it?
Yes, especially when you talk about like the cognitive stuff and the brain stuff. That's newer. Like the effect on muscle performance and strength and athletic performance, like that's pretty well documented. But the applications and the effects in other, aspects of physiology or health or function and performance, there's probably going to be more there is going to be more that we learn about it that we don't know, that we currently don't know. So
All right, cool. Well, if anyone has any other last minute questions, you can go ahead and either pop them in the chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking, or you could just unmute yourself. I'll give it maybe like 15 seconds for you to conjure up something. And if not, we'll go ahead and conclude this meeting. And I'll give people just a little bit more time. I definitely want to thank Dr. Cotter, Dr. Schick, and Dr. Esocbar on behalf of Exercises Medicine. We always enjoy having you guys here. It always brings out like a lot more students too. So it lets you know that students also have like not just the interest in like you guys and getting to know you guys on a different level, but also just like picking your brains outside of the classroom, which is also really cool. So that's one thing I've also experienced as well, just kind of seeing people ask certain questions that they might not have had a chance to in class because they haven't taken that class yet, or maybe even just other things that they think about once they go home and start pondering on creatine or things like that. All right, so last
can I ask a question?
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay. All right. This is to Dr. Schick or Dr. Cotter. All right. So the impact of the anabolic hormones in response to resistance training, we're going to talk in 405, don't seem to be implicated as previously thought. They do affect muscle and anabolism, but the acute post-exercise response is not associated with strength and hypertrophy, right? So that goes with testosterone, IGF-1, growth hormone. Now, the thing that I don't have a clear understanding on, and hopefully maybe you two can clear this up for me. What is the effect of, because there's a difference between systemic IGF-1 that's released versus locally expressed IGF-1. Now, it's not a hormone per se, it has like paracrine effects, right? So, but the relationship of IGF-1 or the increase in IGF-1 is not associated with exercise-induced hypertrophy. However, is locally expressed IGF-1 associated with exercise-induced hypertrophy?
I feel like we've talked about this before, but I could be wrong. To my knowledge, maybe. I'm not like a super expert with that either, Dr. Escobar. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions, and maybe folks aren't even asking the right questions with it. I agree. I've read the same things as you pertaining to central hormones, testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1 as not being great stewards, if you will, of the hypertrophic response. In terms of local factors, that appears to be more of a factor in sparking hypertrophy. IGF-1, I would presume it does, local IGF-1, but I'm not real sure about it. And I think there's a lot that we haven't learned, and I think there's a lot more questions that we need to be asking with it. So I think it's a good question, and one I wish I had a better answer for.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's been a while since I've looked into that. I do think there was something to the local production of IGF-1. I'm afraid it's been such a long time since I've looked at it. But the information does appear to be pretty compelling from, I believe it's the Stuart Phillips group on, the lack of an effect on the acute exercise response from hormones on things like skeletal muscle hypertrophy and all that. I think they've done a pretty good job with it. I feel like it's pretty good data, and I present that in 301 a little bit. And I know, Dr. Escobar, I think you follow up with some more specific studies in your class too. So it is an interesting topic nonetheless, and definitely I think more needs to be done to find out what the effects of things like local IGF-1 are.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Escobar. So it's cool to have like a question from like you or you guys, and you guys talk about it in a sense or whatnot, to just kind of like piggyback off each other and like pick each other's brains. I think that's I think that's always cool. I've seen guys do it in other meetings and stuff like that, but I respect that, and also respect that you guys like respect each other's like craft and knowledge. It's definitely inspiring, and also gives us stuff to like look into ourselves. All right, so with that being said, if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and conclude this meeting just shy of 6:30. Thank you all so much for coming. Again, we do have a follow along workout that's coming up. If you are interested, you can definitely, like I said, find that link in the chat where the RSVP link is. And for now, we will say peace. Thank you all for coming.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
See you later.
Good.